Have you ever wondered what it would be like to attend your own funeral? To hear the eulogies, see the tears streaming down the faces of everyone you love. Watch as they say their final goodbyes while you scream desperately inside your mind for them to stop because you're still alive, still conscious, still fighting. Well, I don't have to wonder anymore because I lived through that absolute nightmare, and what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your very core and make you question everything you thought you knew about life, death, and the thin veil that separates the two. My name used to be just another name in the world, another face in the crowded streets of Chicago, another person rushing to work with a coffee in hand and dreams in my heart. But after what happened to me on that rainy Tuesday morning, I became something else entirely, something I never imagined possible. I became a ghost trapped in my own body, a conscious mind imprisoned in flesh that refused to obey, a voice screaming into an endless void where nobody could hear me except for one person, one beautiful soul who changed everything. This is my story of death and resurrection, of terror and miracle, of being lost and found in the most unimaginable way, and I need you to hear every single word because it could save your life or the life of someone you love. Because the world needs to know that death isn't always what it seems, and consciousness can persist in ways that medical science is only beginning to understand. Everything started on what appeared to be a completely ordinary Tuesday morning in late October, one of those days when the air smells like fallen leaves and rain, when the city wakes up slowly under gray skies, when you drink your coffee and read the news and never imagine that your entire existence is about to be shattered into a million pieces. I remember waking up next to Sarah, my girlfriend of 4 years, watching her sleep peacefully with her dark hair spread across the white pillow like silk, feeling this overwhelming sense of contentment and anticipation because I had a secret that was burning a hole in my sock drawer, the engagement ring. A beautiful princess-cut diamond set in white gold that had cost me 3 months of salary, but was worth every single penny, because I could already imagine the look of joy and surprise on Sarah's face when I got down on one knee, that coming Saturday at her favorite Italian restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. I had it all planned out perfectly, or so I thought, not knowing that fate had entirely different plans for me, plans that would test every fiber of my being and force me to fight for my life in ways I never imagined possible. I was 32 years old, healthy as a horse, working as a senior marketing consultant at a prestigious firm downtown, climbing the corporate ladder with ambition and determination. I went to the gym 3 times a week, ate relatively well, had no serious health problems, no reason whatsoever to think that my life was anything but solid and predictable. I took everything for granted in that blissful ignorance that comes from being young and healthy and alive without really thinking about what being alive actually means. That morning, I kissed Sarah goodbye just like I did every single morning, told her I loved her while she mumbled something sleepy in response, grabbed my briefcase and umbrella, and headed out into the drizzling rain that made the streets shine like dark mirrors reflecting a gray world above. The commute was normal. The elevator ride to my office was normal. The morning greetings from my colleagues were normal. Everything was so beautifully, perfectly, maddeningly normal that I remember thinking how grateful I was for my life, for my health, for my future with Sarah. The universe has a cruel sense of irony sometimes, giving you these moments of pure appreciation right before snatching everything away. My morning meeting went exceptionally well, better than I could have hoped for. I was presenting a major campaign strategy to a potential client worth millions to our firm, and I nailed every single point, watched their faces light up with interest and approval, felt that electric rush of success that makes all the late nights and hard work feel worthwhile. My boss, Richard, a stern man who rarely showed emotion, actually clapped me on the shoulder afterward and told me in his gruff voice that I was being considered for a promotion to creative director, a position I'd been working toward for years. Everything was falling into place like dominoes arranged in perfect sequence, each piece touching the next, creating a beautiful pattern of success and happiness. I felt invincible walking out of that conference room, like nothing in the world could touch me, like I was living in one of those movie montages where the protagonist's life is just getting better and better before the dramatic turn. After the meeting, riding high on adrenaline and success, I decided to walk to my favorite deli 3 blocks away instead of ordering lunch in like I usually did. It was still raining, that persistent Chicago drizzle that gets into everything, but I didn't care because I wanted to feel the city around me, wanted to walk off some of my nervous energy, wanted to breathe in the autumn air and think about my life and my future, and how I was going to propose to Sarah. I texted my best friend Mark while walking, telling him about the promotion news, about how everything was coming together, about how I couldn't wait for Saturday. He sent back a string of celebration emojis and a message saying he was proud of me, that he couldn't wait to be my best man when I finally popped the question. I was smiling at my phone, probably looking like every other distracted pedestrian in the modern world, when I reached the intersection of Madison and Clark. The light was green for pedestrians. I remember that clearly because I'm the kind of person who always waits for the walk signal even when there's no traffic. I stepped off the curb, my mind already at the deli imagining their signature pastrami sandwich when I heard it. That sound, that horrible high-pitched screech of tires sliding on wet asphalt, rubber trying desperately to grip pavement but failing. Time didn't slow down the way people always say it does in moments of crisis. If anything, time sped up, compressed into a fraction of a second that contained an entire universe of terror. I turned my head to the left and saw the delivery truck sliding toward me, massive and unstoppable, the driver's face frozen behind the windshield in an expression of absolute horror that mirrored my own internal scream. His mouth was open wide, his hands gripping the steering wheel uselessly, and I could see in his eyes that he knew what was about to happen and was completely powerless to stop it. There was no time to jump, no time to run, no time to do anything except feel the cold wave of pure animal terror wash over me like ice water in my veins. My briefcase fell from my hand, my umbrella went flying, and then the truck hit me with the force of a freight train, and the world exploded into a supernova of pain and chaos and darkness. I felt bones breaking, felt my body ragdolling through the air, felt the impact of hitting the pavement, and then nothing, absolute nothing. Blackness so complete it was like I'd been erased from existence. But I wasn't erased, I was just somewhere else, somewhere dark and silent and terrifying. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, reluctantly, like waking from the deepest sleep you've ever experienced. At first there was nothing but confusion, a sense of being untethered from reality, floating in some dark space between being and non-being. Then gradually, piece by piece, awareness began to assemble itself. I could hear something, beeping, steady rhythmic beeping. Voices, distant and muffled like they were coming from underwater or from another dimension entirely. I tried to open my eyes, but nothing happened. I tried to move my hand, my fingers, anything, but my body refused to respond. Panic hit me like another truck, slamming into my consciousness with devastating force. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I move? Why couldn't I see? Why couldn't I make my body obey even the simplest command? I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Tried to thrash, but nothing moved. Tried to do anything to signal that I was awake and aware and terrified beyond measure. Nothing. I was completely paralyzed, locked inside my own body like a prisoner in a cell with no doors or windows. The beeping continued its steady rhythm, and I realized with growing horror that it must be a heart monitor, which meant I was in a hospital, which meant something terrible had happened to me, something so bad that I couldn't even move. The voices became clearer as my awareness sharpened, as whatever fog had been clouding my consciousness began to lift. I heard a woman's voice, professional and clinical, saying something about severe trauma, about brainstem damage, about catastrophic injuries. I heard a man responding, his voice deep and measured, using words like irreversible and minimal brain activity and poor prognosis. Terror gripped me with icy fingers that squeezed my trapped consciousness until I thought I would shatter from the pressure. What were they saying about me? What had happened to my brain? I tried again to move, straining with every ounce of mental strength I possessed, trying to force my finger to twitch, my eyelid to flutter, anything at all to show them that I was still here, still conscious, still desperately alive inside this broken shell of a body. But nothing responded. It was like my consciousness had been severed from my physical form, like I was a ghost, haunting my own flesh. Then I heard a sound that made my trapped heart want to explode with grief and longing and desperate love. Sarah's voice. My beautiful Sarah, crying so hard she could barely speak, her words coming out in broken sobs that tore through me like shrapnel. She was begging someone, pleading with doctors to do something, anything to save me, to bring me back, to not let me die. Baby, I'm here, I screamed inside my silent prison. I'm right here. I can hear every word you're saying. Please don't cry. Please know that I'm still fighting, still here, still loving you with everything I am. But she couldn't hear me. Nobody could hear me because the scream existed only in my mind, trapped behind walls of damaged neurons and broken connections. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time became completely meaningless in the darkness of my paralysis. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. Couldn't tell if it was day or night, couldn't tell anything except that I was still conscious, still aware, still trapped. All I had were the sounds around me, the voices that came and went, the steady beeping of machines that were apparently keeping my body alive even though my mind was screaming that I was already here, already alive, already conscious. I heard doctors discussing my case like I was a specimen in a jar, using clinical terminology that reduced me to a collection of symptoms and test results. One of them used a phrase that burned itself into my memory with the white-hot intensity of a brand: locked-in syndrome. He explained to what must have been medical students that it was a rare condition where a patient is conscious and aware but completely paralyzed, unable to move or communicate, except sometimes with eye movements. But then another doctor corrected him, saying that I didn't even have eye movement, that my case was more severe, that I was in a persistent vegetative state with minimal brain activity. "No," I screamed silently. "No, you're wrong. I'm here. I can hear every word. I'm not vegetative. I'm conscious. Please test me again. Please look harder. Please don't give up on me." But of course they couldn't hear my silent protests. I heard Sarah every single day, felt the warmth of her presence even though I couldn't feel her touch. She would sit beside my bed and talk to me for hours, telling me about her day, about how much she missed me, about the little things that were happening in the world outside this hospital prison. One day she told me that she'd found the ring while looking for my insurance papers in my apartment, told me through tears that she knew I'd been planning to propose, told me that her answer would have been yes, would always be yes, would be yes forever if only I could wake up and ask her. The agony of hearing that, of knowing I had come so close to that moment of joy, of realizing I might never get to see her face when she said yes, was worse than any physical pain could ever be. I heard my parents arrive from Florida, heard my mother's wails of anguish when she first saw me lying motionless in the hospital bed, heard my father's voice crack for the first time in my entire life as he held my hand and begged me to come back. I wanted to squeeze his hand so badly, wanted to tell him I loved him, wanted to do anything to ease their suffering, but I was powerless, completely and utterly powerless. The worst part wasn't even the paralysis itself, as horrific as that was. The worst part was listening to the conversations that happened just outside my room when my family thought I couldn't hear them. The doctors recommended that my family consider end-of-life options, said that I had no quality of life, that the kindest thing would be to let me go peacefully. I heard my mother sobbing that she couldn't bear to see her baby like this anymore. Heard my father agree in a voice heavy with grief that I wouldn't have wanted to live this way. And I heard Sarah, my beautiful Sarah who I'd been planning to marry, say through her tears that she loved me too much to watch me suffer, that if the doctor said there was no hope, then maybe they needed to let me go with dignity. "No, no, no, no," I screamed into the void of my paralysis. "Don't let me go. I'm here. I'm still here. There is hope because I'm conscious and aware and fighting every second to show you." But they couldn't hear me, and the decision was made. They were going to remove life support, going to let me slip away peacefully, going to kill me while I was still fully conscious and aware. The day they removed the ventilator tube, I waited to feel myself suffocating, to feel my lungs burn for oxygen, to experience the physical sensation of dying. But my body kept breathing on its own, shallow and weak but steady enough to continue without the machine. The doctors said it wouldn't last long, that my breathing was too shallow to sustain life for more than a few hours or perhaps days at most, that it was just my body's automatic functions continuing briefly, before shutting down permanently. They moved me out of the ICU to make room for patients who had a chance at survival, moved me to a quiet room where my family could say their goodbyes in private. But something went wrong with the transfer, or maybe my body finally decided to betray me completely, because somewhere during that move the faint signs of life I'd been showing disappeared. I heard a nurse checking my vitals sound alarmed, heard her say she couldn't find a pulse, heard someone else confirm that I appeared to have passed. I wanted to rage against the assessment, wanted to scream that I was still here, still conscious, but nothing worked. My body had become such an effective prison that even the medical professionals with all their equipment couldn't detect the life still burning inside. They pronounced me dead. I heard the doctor say the time of death, heard him express his condolences to my family, heard Sarah's fresh wave of grief as she realized I was gone. Except I wasn't gone. I was right there, trapped in darkness, screaming soundlessly as they covered my face with a sheet and wheeled me out of the room. The journey to the morgue was a descent into hell. I felt the change in temperature as we moved through the hospital corridors, felt myself being transferred from the gurney to a cold metal table, heard the echo of voices in what must have been a large, sterile room. Someone was discussing the logistics of my body, talking about the funeral home that would be collecting me, about the paperwork that needed to be completed, about me like I was already just an object instead of a person. I tried to scream, tried to move, tried to do anything to show them the horrific mistake they were making. But I remained as still and silent as the corpse they believed me to be. Then I heard discussion about embalming, about preparing my body for viewing, and a new level of terror consumed me that I didn't know was possible. They were going to pump chemicals into my veins, going to drain my blood, going to do things to my body that would actually kill me while I was still conscious inside. The existential horror of that realization was beyond anything I can adequately describe. But then a voice spoke up, an older woman with a thick Spanish accent, saying something about protocol and paperwork and waiting for family authorization before beginning any procedures. I could have wept with relief if I'd been capable of producing tears. They placed me in cold storage to wait, and the temperature drop was shocking. The first true physical sensation I'd experienced since the accident beyond the vague awareness of being moved or touched. The cold was deep and penetrating, seeping into me in a way that I could somehow perceive even through my paralysis. Hours passed in that freezing darkness, and my consciousness began to drift, to fade in and out like a radio signal losing strength. I wondered if this was how it would end, not with the dramatic violence of embalming, but with a slow dissolution, my awareness gradually dissipating until there was nothing left but the empty shell they already believed me to be. Then I heard activity outside my cold drawer, heard voices discussing funeral arrangements, heard my drawer being opened and my body being removed. They were preparing me for the funeral, I realized with dawning horror. They were going to put me in a casket and hold a service and bury me in the ground while I was still conscious. The absolute nightmare of that scenario consumed me completely. I was going to be buried alive, going to spend my final moments of consciousness in a coffin 6 feet underground, suffocating slowly in the darkness until my brain finally died from lack of oxygen. I heard them dressing me in what must have been the suit my mother had chosen, heard them discussing my appearance, whether the makeup was covering the bruising adequately, whether I looked peaceful. I wanted to laugh hysterically at that. Peaceful. There was nothing peaceful about the screaming hurricane of terror and desperation that was my trapped consciousness. The day of my funeral arrived, and I knew it because of the sounds of increased activity, of people arriving, of chairs being arranged, of flowers being placed. I was moved again, positioned in what must have been my casket, and I could hear everything with a clarity that seemed to have sharpened rather than diminished. The funeral home filled with people, and I heard their whispered conversations, heard them expressing shock and sadness about my sudden death, heard them sharing memories and stories about me. The service began with the funeral director asking everyone to take their seats, and then the pastor started speaking in that special tone that people use when talking about the dead, that combination of reverence and comfort that's supposed to make everyone feel better about the loss. He talked about God's plan and eternal rest and how I was in a better place now, and I wanted to scream that I wasn't in a better place, that I was right here in the worst place imaginable, conscious and terrified and desperate for someone to realize the truth. My boss spoke about what a dedicated employee I'd been, about the bright future I'd had ahead of me, using the past tense that made it all feel so final and horrible. Then Mark stood up to give the eulogy, and his voice broke almost immediately. He talked about our friendship, about the adventures we'd had together, about inside jokes that nobody else in the room would understand, about how he'd been looking forward to being my best man and how it broke his heart that he'd never get that chance. Every word was a knife cutting into my trapped soul because these were goodbye speeches, final farewells, and I wasn't ready to be farewelled. I wasn't ready to be mourned. I was still here, still fighting, still desperately alive. Then Sarah stood up and the room fell completely silent. I could hear her shaking as she unfolded a piece of paper, could hear her take several deep breaths trying to compose herself enough to speak. She began to read a poem we'd both loved, something about souls finding each other across lifetimes, about love being stronger than death, about how the people we love never truly leave us. Her voice broke on almost every line, and I could hear the tears streaming down her face, could feel the weight of her grief like a physical thing pressing down on my consciousness. This was unbearable. This was torture beyond anything I'd imagined possible. I screamed. I screamed with every single atom of my being, a soundless howl of anguish and desperation that should have shattered the windows and stopped every heart in the room. I screamed for Sarah, for my parents, for my life, for everything I was losing, for the future that was being buried with me. I screamed until it felt like my consciousness would tear itself apart from the sheer effort of trying to be heard. And then, impossibly, miraculously, someone heard me. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and she was a cleaning lady at the funeral home. An older Hispanic woman in her 60s who probably spent her days wiping down pews and polishing brass fixtures and emptying trash cans, invisible to most people who walked through those doors of grief and farewell. But she was standing somewhere near my casket, probably straightening flowers or picking up a used tissue, when I screamed, and somehow, through some mechanism I will never understand, she heard me. I didn't know she'd heard me at first. All I knew was that suddenly there was a gasp, sharp and shocked, and then the sound of something hitting the floor. I heard rapid footsteps approaching my casket, heard breathing that was quick and frightened, and then I heard her voice, speaking rapidly in Spanish, words I couldn't fully understand but whose tone was unmistakable. She was frightened and confused, and certain that something was wrong. Rosa called out, her voice cutting through Sarah's poem like a knife, and suddenly the room erupted in confused murmuring. I heard the funeral director's voice, smooth and professional but with an edge of irritation, asking what was wrong. Rosa was speaking in broken English now, her accent thick but her words clear enough. She said she heard something, heard someone crying out, heard a voice coming from the casket. The funeral director tried to calm her down, tried to tell her in a patronizing tone that it was impossible, that she must have been mistaken, that grief and emotion sometimes make us hear things that aren't there. But Rosa was insistent, her voice rising with urgency and conviction. She kept saying she knew what she heard, that she wasn't imagining things, that something was wrong and they needed to check. I felt a surge of desperate hope flood through me. This was it. This was my chance. Possibly my only chance. I gathered every scrap of consciousness I possessed, every bit of mental energy I had left, and I screamed again, putting everything I had into it, begging the universe to let this woman hear me one more time, to give me this one miracle. And she did. Rosa cried out again, louder this time, pointing at my casket with a trembling hand. She was speaking rapidly in Spanish and English, mixing the languages in her agitation, saying she heard it again, saying there was someone alive in there, saying they needed to check immediately before it was too late. The funeral director was clearly uncomfortable now, caught between wanting to dismiss her as hysterical and not wanting to cause a scene in front of the grieving family. But then my mother's voice cut through the confusion, sharp and desperate and filled with a hope that must have been painful to feel. She said to check. She said that if there was even the slightest chance, even the smallest possibility, they had to check right now. I heard my father agree, his voice rough with emotion. I heard Sarah saying, "Please, please check, please let her be right." The funeral director sighed, clearly thinking this was going to be an embarrassing moment that he'd have to smooth over, but he agreed to examine me to put everyone's minds at rest. I felt the casket being opened wider, felt the change in air against my face, felt hands on my neck feeling for a pulse. There was a long moment of terrible silence, and then the funeral director's voice, uncertain now, shocked, saying he thought he felt something. It was faint, barely there, but he thought there might be a pulse. Suddenly the room erupted into controlled chaos. Someone was calling 911, their voice shaking as they reported that someone who had been declared dead might actually be alive. Someone else was pulling me out of the casket, laying me on the floor. I heard Rosa praying loudly in Spanish, her voice rising above the commotion, thanking God and all the saints. I heard Sarah screaming my name over and over, heard my mother crying and praying simultaneously, and I felt it, felt hands on my chest beginning CPR, felt the rhythmic compressions, felt myself being pulled back from the brink by the sheer force of human determination and hope. The paramedics arrived, and suddenly there were professional voices cutting through the emotional chaos, taking control of the situation with practiced efficiency. I heard equipment being deployed, heard the crackle of radio communications, heard someone saying they were getting a faint heartbeat. Then I felt the shock of the defibrillator, felt my body convulse from the electrical charge. Once, twice, 3 times. On the third shock, something changed inside me. It was like a circuit that had been broken suddenly reconnected, like a door that had been rusted shut for years suddenly swinging open. The paralysis began to crack, began to crumble, and suddenly I could feel my body again. The pain came first, overwhelming and intense, radiating from what felt like every cell in my body. But pain meant I was alive, meant my nervous system was working, meant I was more than just consciousness floating in darkness. I felt air rushing into my lungs in deep, gasping breaths. I felt my heart pounding frantically in my chest. I felt sensation returning to my limbs like fire and ice simultaneously. My eyes fluttered open and the world swam into focus slowly, shapes and colors blurring together before gradually sharpening into recognizable forms. I saw faces leaning over me, saw expressions of shock and joy and disbelief and hope all mixed together. I saw Sarah's face, her makeup completely ruined by tears, her eyes wide with something between terror and ecstasy. I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry and damaged that all that came out was a rasping whisper, but it was enough. I managed to say her name, Sarah. Just that one word, barely audible, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever made. The room erupted again, this time with joy instead of panic. People were crying and laughing simultaneously, calling it a miracle, calling it impossible, calling it the most incredible thing they'd ever witnessed. The paramedics were all business, stabilizing my vital signs, preparing to transport me back to the hospital, but even their professional demeanors couldn't quite hide their shock at what they were witnessing. As they loaded me onto the gurney, I managed to turn my head just enough to see Rosa standing off to the side, her weathered hands clasped together in prayer, tears streaming down her face and catching the light like diamonds. Our eyes met across the chaos of the room, and in that moment something passed between us that needed no words, no explanation. She had heard me when no one else could. She had refused to be silenced when everyone else wanted to dismiss her. She had saved my life through simple faith and courage and the willingness to trust what she knew to be true even when it seemed impossible. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and urgent voices, and Sarah's hand gripping mine like she would never let go, like she could keep me tethered to life through sheer force of will. The emergency room doctors were completely baffled by my case. They ran every test imaginable, scanned my brain from every possible angle, checked and rechecked my vital signs, tried desperately to understand how someone who had been pronounced dead, who had been in a morgue, who had been minutes away from being buried, could be alive and conscious and speaking. The diagnosis they eventually settled on was a rare and extreme form of locked-in syndrome, combined with a stress response so severe that it had caused my vital signs to become almost undetectable. They theorized that the accident had caused specific brainstem damage that paralyzed my body, while leaving my consciousness intact, and that the trauma had sent my body into a kind of hibernation state where my heart rate and breathing had slowed to levels that were nearly impossible to detect with standard methods. They said the cold storage in the morgue had actually helped preserve my brain function, had kept me alive when I should have died. They said I was incredibly lucky, the luckiest person they'd ever seen. But I knew it wasn't luck. It was Rosa. It was her willingness to listen, to trust her instincts, to speak up when it would have been easier to stay silent. The recovery process was long and brutally difficult. I had to relearn everything my body had forgotten during the time I was paralyzed. Simple things like moving my fingers felt impossibly hard at first, like trying to operate a machine whose controls I'd forgotten. Physical therapy was excruciating, pushing my damaged muscles and nerves to work again, forcing my body to remember how to walk, how to grasp objects, how to perform 1,000 tiny actions I'd never thought about before. But harder than the physical recovery was the psychological trauma of what I'd been through. I had nightmares constantly, dreams where I was trapped in my paralyzed body again, where I was being buried alive, where I screamed and screamed but nobody could hear me. I developed panic attacks that would hit me without warning, sudden overwhelming waves of terror that I was still trapped, and everything around me was just a hallucination my dying brain was creating. I needed therapy, both physical and psychological, to process what had happened to me, to find a way to live with the memories of my own funeral, to cope with the trauma of having been pronounced dead while fully conscious. But there were also moments of pure joy that made all the struggle worthwhile. The first time I was able to lift my hand to touch Sarah's face and feel the warmth of her skin against my palm, I cried with happiness. The first time I could speak clearly enough to tell my parents I loved them without my words coming out as a broken whisper. I saw the relief and joy in their eyes that made everything worth it. The first time I stood on my own 2 feet without assistance, shaking but upright, I felt like I'd climbed Mount Everest. Sarah never left my side through any of it. She was there for every painful physical therapy session, every nightmare, every panic attack, every small victory and major setback. The engagement ring that had been hidden in my sock drawer was now on her finger, because I'd proposed to her from my hospital bed 2 weeks after waking up, unable to kneel but able to offer her my heart and whatever future we could build together. I asked her if she still wanted to marry someone who came with nightmares and trauma and a long road to recovery, and she said yes before I could even finish the question, said yes with tears streaming down her face, said yes like it was the easiest answer in the world. 6 months after my funeral, I was walking again without assistance, though I still tired easily and had to rest frequently. A year later, I was back at work part-time, relearning skills and rebuilding relationships with colleagues who had mourned me and were now adjusting to having me back among the living. 2 years later, Sarah and I got married in a small ceremony where Rosa sat in the front row next to my parents, honored as the hero she was, the woman who had heard what nobody else could hear and had refused to stay silent. I never found a scientific explanation for how Rosa heard me that day. She told me it was God speaking through me, that she'd heard not my physical voice but the voice of my soul crying out for help, and that God had given her the gift of spiritual hearing in that moment because she was meant to save me. The doctors said it might have been a small vocalization I somehow managed to produce, or perhaps a sound created by escaping gas or a muscle spasm, something that technically could be explained, but was so unlikely that it might as well have been a miracle. But I know the truth, even if I can't prove it or explain it in scientific terms. Rosa heard me because some people are tuned to frequencies that most of us miss, because some souls are open in ways that allow them to perceive what others cannot, because the universe sometimes works in ways that transcend our understanding of what's possible. She heard me because I desperately needed to be heard, and she was the one person in that room whose heart was open enough to listen, not just with her ears, but with something deeper. The experience changed me in fundamental ways that I'm still discovering years later. I notice things now that I never noticed before, things I took completely for granted in my old life. The way sunlight looks streaming through a window in the morning, turning dust motes into tiny galaxies floating in golden light. The sound of Sarah's laugh, that particular melody that's uniquely hers. The feeling of rain on my skin, each drop a tiny miracle of sensation. The taste of coffee, the smell of flowers, the sensation of being hugged by someone who loves you. All of these things that seemed ordinary before now feel precious and profound. I notice people who are invisible to others, the cleaning staff and service workers and quiet individuals who move through the world doing essential work without recognition or appreciation. I see them now because one of them saved my life, because Rosa taught me that sometimes the most important people are the ones we overlook. I make it a point to acknowledge them, to thank them, to see them as the valuable human beings they are. I also became acutely, painfully aware of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change, how we walk around assuming we'll have tomorrow when tomorrow is never guaranteed. I learned that we're all just one random accident, one medical emergency, one twist of fate away from losing everything we take for granted. But instead of making me anxious or fearful, this awareness has made me more present, more grateful, more determined to make every moment count. I don't waste time on petty arguments anymore. I tell people I love them regularly and sincerely. I pursue experiences rather than accumulating things. I try to be kinder, more patient, more understanding, because I know how precious and brief our time together really is. I speak at medical conferences now, sharing my story with doctors and nurses and emergency responders, helping them understand that consciousness can persist even when all conventional signs suggest it's gone. I've helped update death verification protocols at several hospitals, advocating for more thorough checks and longer observation periods before pronouncing someone deceased. I've raised money for research into locked-in syndrome and disorders of consciousness, trying to ensure that what happened to me happens to fewer people in the future. But mostly I just live, with intention and gratitude and awareness that every single breath is a gift. Sarah and I have a daughter now, a beautiful little girl we named Rose after Rosa, and when she's old enough to understand, we'll tell her the incredible story of how her father came back from his own funeral, How a woman nobody noticed became the most important person in our lives. How love and persistence and faith can create miracles. Every year on the anniversary of that day, both our families and Rosa's family gather together for what we call the resurrection party, a celebration of life and second chances and the mysterious ways we're all connected. We eat and laugh and tell stories, and I give a toast to Rosa, to unlikely heroes, to the power of listening, to being alive. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt unheard, where you knew something was wrong but everyone dismissed you? Have you ever ignored your instincts because speaking up seemed too difficult or embarrassing? Share your story in the comments below because your experiences matter and might help someone else find the courage to speak up when it counts. Understanding this story means recognizing that consciousness is more mysterious than we realize, that medical science still has so much to learn, that sometimes miracles happen through human intervention rather than divine, through one person refusing to ignore what they know to be true. If this story has touched your heart, if it's made you think differently about life and death and the importance of really listening to people, then please hit that like button. It helps us share these incredible true stories with more people who might need to hear them, who might be going through their own struggles with feeling invisible or unheard. Make sure you subscribe to I Live to Tell for more amazing stories of survival, resilience, and the incredible capacity of the human spirit to overcome impossible odds. We share new stories every week that will challenge everything you think you know about what's possible, that will inspire you to live more fully and appreciate every moment. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, because you never know which one might change your perspective or even save your life someday. Thank you for listening to my journey from death back to life, for honoring Rosa's courage and Sarah's love and my family's faith. Remember that you're alive right now in this moment, reading these words, breathing, thinking, feeling, and that's a miracle worth celebrating every single day.